This is episode 112 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is now available on our very own digital app. This app works on your tablet, phone, or TV and lets you explore the history of William Shakespeare with exclusive content, interviews, and documentaries not available anywhere else. You can cook, dance, and play your way through the life of William Shakespeare, all without any commercials. Find out more at cassidycash.com/experience and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Philippa Lacey-Bruhl of British History Tours. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
The use of the fork for eating was largely unheard of, being an Italian custom. However, special forks were used at banquets. There were two-pronged forks used for carving and picking up small delicacies in England in the 16th century. Forks as a regular table utensil were introduced first in the late Renaissance Italy. And even then, they were elaborate, expensive utensils used only by the most fastidious of diners.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Today, we sit down to a properly set table and expect to see, at minimum, a fork, a knife, and a spoon. More elaborate place settings will have more utensils, of course, but for William Shakespeare, his lifetime was the first moment in England's history when dining habits were caught somewhere between the age of eating with one's hands and the advent of proper utensils at the dining table. While the invention of the fork happened centuries prior to William Shakespeare, the fashion of using them specifically to eat at a table for meals did not arrive in Europe until the youth of Shakespeare's parents, when in 1533, Catherine de Medici of France traveled from Italy to France to marry Henry II. Across Europe, the couple held massive festivals to demonstrate their power, including the showcase of Catherine's unique eating methods, which was namely the fork. As the custom of eating with a fork made its way across Europe, the fork was met with a mixed reception and even morphed into a political symbol at one point. By the time William Shakespeare was taking the world by storm, the fork was a novel eating instrument in England which fascinated some while infuriating others. Here to help us explore what the experience of eating at a table and using a fork would have been like for William Shakespeare is our guest and now three-time visitor here at That Shakespeare Life, Tudor enthusiast, expert culinary historian, and my friend, Brigitte Webster. Brigitte Webster is the owner and lead historian at the Tudor and 17th Century Experience. Born in Austria, Brigitte trained and served as a school teacher for 25 years. Her qualification was in history and cooking, a combination that has finally come together in her current career as a culinary historian. She currently works on a number of publications on international cuisine, specifically focusing on the 16th and 17th century. The Tudor and 17th Century Experience is a venture that finally allows her to share her passion for all things Tudor with a wider audience, especially now that she and her husband have at last moved into their dream home of an authentic Tudor manor. Their Tudor manor is open to the public for tours, but on a schedule. So to find out when and how you can visit their Tudor manor, make sure you visit their website, which I'll place in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Brigitte. Welcome to the show.
Hello. I'm so excited to be back.
It's wonderful to have you back again. We're diving into the history of forks this week, and there is Thomas Coryat in his publication titled Coryat's Crudités, dated 1611, when Shakespeare was 47 years old. He writes, quote, "I observed a custom in all those Italian cities and towns through the which I passed that is not used in any other country that I saw in my travels. Neither do I think that any other nation of Christendom doth use it, but only Italy. The Italian and also most strangers that are common in Italy do always at their meals use a fork when they cut their meat. He goes on to describe the act of eating with a knife and fork at a table before saying, quote, "This form of feeding, I understand, is generally used in all places of Italy, their forks being for the most part made of iron or steel and some of silver, but those are used only by gentlemen." Thomas continues that saying that though it's good to imitate the fashion, not only in Germany where he was from, but specifically cites that when he used the fork in England, he was made fun of profusely by someone there who called him a, quote, table furcifer for using a fork at feeding, but for no other cause. Now, Brigitte, I'm not certain what the insult of being a table furcifer might mean, but it definitely sounds from this account as if England was not receptive to the fork at the table during meals. For Shakespeare's lifetime, did England frown upon the idea of using a fork?
It certainly was no compliment and would have been regarded as a light-hearted insult, meaning something on the line of a pitchfork handler. So a furcifer came from the Latin villain and is a play on the name of Lucifer. And apparently he was awarded this nickname by his contemporary, a Mr. John Taylor, after adopting the fork following his journey to Italy in the early 17th century. And a friend of mine who researches this John Taylor told me that he referred to Thomas as a forked, ferreted, and finely fetched over the coals. Gentlemen.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Well, in England, the knife was the principal eating utensil, used to cut portions from communal dishes and bring them to a diner's own plate or trencher, when the bite-sized portions would have been eaten with the fingers. The use of the fork for eating was largely unheard of, being an Italian custom. Now, however, special forks were used at banquets to spear delicate squares of suckets, such as the iconic Tudor marmalade, which was often very tacky and sticky. Now, although there were two-pronged forks used for carving and picking up small delicacies in England in the 16th century, forks as a regular table utensil were introduced first in the late Renaissance Italy. And even then, they were elaborate, expensive utensils used only by the most fastidious of diners. From Italy, the fork then made its way to first France, and 100 years later started to arrive in England at last. But even then, and we're now talking about the early 1600s, they were still widely viewed as something very overly posh and unnecessary. It was actually not until the 18th century that they were widely used. It took such a long time for the fork to migrate north of the Alps also, because it alarmed moralists who feared that eating with the new tool would somehow weaken or corrupt people. So,
a rampant fear of in this time
I
period.
think it had something to do with it being an Italian thing.
I see.
And the Italians being Catholic, and you could go a lot more deeper into it, but I am pretty convinced there is something there.
Well, now Catherine de Medici used the fork as a political weapon as she crossed Europe in the mid-16th century. So, I mean, some of those fears might be associated with the idea of it being this force to attack you with. But I wondered, with there being, Elizabeth I having both superstitions and being a political force herself, is there any evidence that she may have also used the fork the way Catherine de Medici did as a political weapon?
Interesting question. Now, in regards to Elizabeth in particular, the only evidence we have is that in the inventory of the Royal Jewellery House, taken in 1574, lists 3 silver forks. But these were most likely used for sweetmeats and suckets, so basically sticky desserts, and were not meant to be used to take food into your mouth. So it's pretty certain that she did not use it as we know it.
At the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, they have in their collection a set of knives called wedding knives. And I'll post a picture of these objects in the show notes for today's episode so you can see it at cassidycash.com/episode 112. But Brigitte, I was surprised when I saw these knives because they're called wedding knives, and the description on the museum's page describes it as a gift for the bride, and it's housed in this really decorative sheath. So my mind directly went towards the idea of a wedding gift, or, you know, cutting the cake at a bridal party. And then I started looking into it and I went, oh no, that's not what this is. So please explain the cultural history here. Why were knives given to the bride as a present in the first place? And then why is there only one knife in the sheath?
Right. It's actually fascinating, those wedding knives and what and how they were used. Now, the personal nature of cutlery made them also popular presents at key rites of passage, such as christenings or weddings. And it was custom that the brides and grooms traditionally also exchanged spoons at weddings. But it was also customary for English bridegrooms to give his new wife a pair of so-called bride knives. And that is a practice that was also common in early modern Holland. But there it started since the 14th century. But such knives are also depicted in many Dutch paintings. And it is believed that this charming custom was introduced to England by continental members of Henry VIII's court. And the bride was expected to use and keep them for the duration of their whole marriage. Now, symbolic of the couple, she would then have made an embroidered or beaded sheath with matching pockets, and a cord was attached to it, which was also known as the cowl and string, in which they carried the knives on their very person. Now, these knives were frequently made in pairs, funny enough, at this time anyway, and was used to cut one for bread and the other one for cutting meat. Now, a Richard Barnfield, in a poem called The Affectionate Shepherd from 1594, actually says, and that's quite charming, a pair of knives, a green hat and a feather, new gloves to put upon thy milk-white handle, I'll give thee. Isn't that charming?
That is so sweet.
Yeah, it is. But the brides presented with such gifts would not only have been really pleased with the knife's appearance, but would also have felt socially elevated, since there was an element of social snobbery in the giving of such gifts amongst especially the merchant class. And these fortunate ladies would have sported their cowls and strings upon, well, every possible occasion. And it is, in a way, however, strange that only a few period portraits of ladies in their Elizabethan finery actually show them to be wearing those knives. Now, makes you think perhaps that the wearing of knives was considered possibly housewifery or very middle class by the aristocracy, who would have then considered the display as too vulgar. But interesting for our Shakespeare fans, He, in his 1597 folio, insisted that Juliet should wear her wedding knives, and in Speed's map of 1631, which shows Europe, the English ladies are also wearing their knives in this customary manner. And there's another interesting bit I found, which I think is very interesting, and that's there is a record of wedding knives which can be admired at a church in Herefordshire in a place called Rossonnier in St. Mary's Church, where there is a tomb of William and his wife Anne Ruddle. She died in 1530, but it's showing her figure and the purse below her left hand, and on her right side there is this coal and string showing. So this is a most magnificent little evidence that these were worn, even though they don't show in portraits much. But sadly, the Puritans, again, detested that very idea of wearing the Sunday knives, as it was seen as a popish taste, and that sadly led to their disappear eventually.
Well, that's sad. And actually, it's amazing that you point that out about Juliet. I'm going to have to look into that further because I know there's a part in Romeo and Juliet where the stage directions call for Juliet to draw her knife. And that's been a question when I was the dramaturg on a production of Romeo and Juliet. They were asking me, like, where does she get the knife from? Like, this is so random. Why does she have it? And that would explain it, why she had it there.
Because she had it on her body.
It's brilliant. Yeah. Now, when someone would go to eat, though, at a table for Shakespeare's lifetime, at, let's say, Clement's Inn, for example, because Shakespeare mentions Clement's Inn along with the word fork in Henry IV, Part 2. When you went to an inn, would a patron have been given a set of utensils to eat with in that setting?
Well, it was customary until the very end of the 16th century for diners to bring their very own cutlery to a meal. And so dining utensils were often personalized and with the owner's name and initials, or even a family heraldic device. Now, when knives were provided, that was roughly from 1600 onwards, they were held in a blunt-ended cone-shaped container with a circular base, and that was made of leather, ivory, or sometimes boxwood. And the knives hafts protruded so that the guests could help themselves. But this custom only really started to be accepted by the second quarter of the 17th century, so a bit after Shakespeare, really. But every traveling gentleman were expected to bring their own cutlery, not only to a public eating house, but also as guests in other people's houses. It was only toward the end of the early modern period that tables were set with a full range of utensils, as a matter of course. And a piece of cutlery for eating could be a very personal item, rarely shared with anyone else, and frequently was carried on the person when traveling.
We know from our studies of Shakespeare that England was rife with superstition. You mentioned this earlier, with there being superstitions related to the fork. What were the superstitions held in England? We've mentioned the Puritans not liking them or thinking that they were popish. Can you explain that a little better? What were the superstitions they thought were happening with the use of a fork?
Right. Well, it wasn't actually the fork itself, but the material of the handle. Some examples were definitely made from bloodstone, onyx, cornelian, jet, coral, serpentine, green jasper, or even unicorn horn, as we now know as narwhal tusk. And some were believed to hold upper trophaic powers, especially rock crystal was said to be especially effective. at driving off or even detecting and neutralizing poison. Now that perceived danger of poisoning, and in particular in Italy again, was so great that until the 1550s, guild regulations throughout Western Europe obliged that cutlers who made knife blades had to fill in the hollow left by the stamp mark with brass to prevent poison from being introduced through the knife. Yeah,
because you could poison yourself with your own knife. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Well, what about Shakespeare? Would he have had his own set of cutlery for eating with?
Well, every self-respecting middling-class gentleman, and that included Shakespeare, would have invested at least in some silver tableware. We know, for instance, from various wills, indeed William Shakespeare specified in his will that his plate in particular should go to his youngest living heir, his granddaughter, Elizabeth Hall, with the exception of his broad silver and gilt bowl, which he then gifted to his daughter Judith. Now, it sounds like a substantial and showy item, and was probably for the use of washing hands after a meal, though it probably lacked the accompanying ewer, and therefore this broad bowl and the ewers facilitated and signified lavish hospitality, so important to Shakespeare, really. And it could have been purely financial as a way of topping up his daughter's inheritance. But Shakespeare clearly wanted to keep up with the neighbors, and he would have had silverware, and that included definitely knives and spoons, but not a fork as we know it.
So what did the forks, when they were used for the delicacies, sweetmeats and things like that, you mentioned 2 prongs. Were they ever more than 2, or were they long prongs? What do they look like physically when we see them?
Yeah, the earliest forks had 2 prongs and could also be fantastically ornate, studded with gems, enameled and crusted with gold. But slightly later examples can show 3, but the 4 really only started to turn up in the 18th century. Now, all these were a way to flaunt your wealth as much as a practical means of serving and consuming food. And forks were the tool of the very posh. We mustn't forget that. The very wealthy initially identified the fork actually with women. That, again, with eating sweets. There is actually a famous Dutch painting by the name of The Bean King by Jacob. I don't know whether I pronounced that correctly, Jordaens the Elder, from about 1640. It's now in the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna, but it clearly shows a lady holding such a fork, and she is clearly enjoying some sweet meat. Now, several early examples were also paired with matching knives and kept in a special carrying case. It's also interesting to note that in Europe, the fork developed quite differently than it did in America. The tines were longer and sharper and were used to skewer food, where the fork was, and still is, held in the left hand with the tines pointing downward, and the hallmark is on the curved inside rather than on the back. Now, I didn't know that before. So that to me was very interesting to find out.
That is really interesting. I didn't know about those differences, that they would evolve so differently. You'd think they would be similar given America's history. But so in addition to unicorn horn, what were the materials that they used to make cutlery? I know you mentioned the cutler and him having to protect the fork against poison with brass. But if he wasn't making forks for the average person because they were out of fashion, then what was the tableware the average English family was using?
Right, yeah. The cutler made primarily blades, knife blades. And knives together with spoons were really all you needed at that time. Much of the flatware, or sometimes referred to as flat plate, as it was known for the affluent class in particular, was made of gold, silver, or silver gilt. And for the tines, the fork and the knife blades were made of tougher steel. Forks for picking up sticky sweetmeat and other sweets, but not for putting into your mouth, were really the only tool, even for the wealthy in England, as nobody else had the need for such a tool, as sugar was such a status ingredient. But the poor often had a spoon made of wood, but the middling sort had at least pewter spoons or knives.
Now, we've established that the table setting would not have included forks and that you would have only had the knife and spoon. But if you were to visit, let's say Shakespeare's home there in Stratford-upon-Avon, his birthplace, and that house, if you were to sit down at a table, was there any kind of table setting when you went to eat, or did everybody just brought their own and got it out there at the table?
Right. Well, in poor households, and that's where, when Shakespeare was young, the eating vessels would have been all made from wood or low-fired earthenware pottery. And even in wealthy homes, earthenware was the most important material used for eating vessels. Individual dinner plates only gradually replaced the bread or the wooden trencher. And this meant that food could be served with a sauce on a plate rather than in a separate dipping bowl. Now, every individual was also now, in Shakespeare's time, given his or her own plate rather than sharing from a mess, as was the custom in previous centuries. Now, for the very wealthy, that Shakespeare in his later life, therefore, porcelain dishes from Asia started to be the fashion. And a more affordable alternative was delft from the Netherlands. Drinking vessels in affluent households were made from salt glaze, stoneware, imported from Germany, or even glass for those who could afford such an expensive material. Now, early glass, often referred to as forest glass, was greenish in color and sometimes studded with little gobs of glass, probably to prevent it from slipping out of your greasy fingers. And the most delicate and the very best quality glass came from just outside Venice. But I don't think Shakespeare would even have had the funds to pay for those. Now, in more humble households, people drank from wooden bowls and earthenware ones. Also appearing on the more elegant tables were small salt cellars, which could sometimes be elaborate affairs made of gold and precious gems, often in the shape of a boat called a nef. And a dining table would be covered in several layers of cloth. Between courses, the tablecloth would then be removed one by one, hence the English name for the final course, called a remove. The diners would also be draped with napkins, slung over your shoulder and ready for wiping your fingers. So again, we don't need the fork. The introduction of eating forks made hand washing during dinners actually unnecessary. And this led eventually to the phasing out of ewers and basins in most dining contexts anyway.
My grandmother is absolutely pitching a fit. I think I can hear her from here. The whole idea of putting your napkin over your shoulder. So many times as a child, I was taught to put it in your lap, put it in your lap. It's so funny to think of it being draped over the shoulder. Well, now what about a home eating space? Where was the table located in one of these houses? Did they have a separate section of the home that was considered a dining room?
Right. Now, that's very interesting because in the 16th century, it all starts to change. What used to be the norm over many, many centuries, in Shakespeare's time, we see real change. For instance, in Shakespeare's new place, the hall and the parlour had long been considered a paired unit. The hall was only used for ceremonial feasting, and most dining would actually have taken place in the parlour, offering him and his family a more intimate withdrawing space. Now, during the late part of the 16th century, we see a general decline in the traditional use of the Great Hall for formal dining, and a rise in the status of the parlour on the ground floor, and later the Great Chamber on the first floor, which became the most prestigious entertaining space and the place to eat. Many middling households now had the opportunity to dine and entertain in another room. So not the hall, but which we now refer to the symbolic hall, fun enough, were often retained and modified by having a chimney or a floor inserted with a chamber above. And from the later 16th century, daily dining was taking place elsewhere, but not in the hall. And only the lesser middling people continued to dine in the hall, as it was basically their only main room. Now, interesting, in towns, some dining rooms, as described in many inventories, were apparently above the kitchen. Now, that's quite interesting because the kitchen in itself would have been outside the main house. Now, the largest first floor chamber could also accommodate dining as well as leisure functions. And even in our own home here, our house is a prime example where the old Great Hall was actually diminished in its height to a single-story hall and a floor put in for extra rooms above. And the emphasis was put on the showy chamber on the first floor, where all the main social space basically started to develop from.
Now, I want to distinguish for people who may not be familiar with Brigitte's home. She lives in an authentic Tudor house. So when she's describing what her home looks like, it's because this is from the exact time period we're talking about. And you can see her home and pictures of it on their website, which I'll link to in the show notes for today. Now, if you're imagining this space in your mind as an American, Brigitte, I want to make a distinction between what you're calling the first floor, because I believe there's a separation here.
True, very true. I totally forgot about that. Yes. When we here in the UK talk about first floor, we mean actually the floor above the ground floor. So you always would have to go upstairs to get to the first floor.
So this is not an area of the house that would be in the same space as the major living areas. This would be sort of a separate, you'd have to travel to get to it.
Exactly. And that is the main difference. When Shakespeare was possibly a little boy, people would have eaten and be entertained downstairs on the ground level, in the hall, where as he grew up, he would have noticed that people started to do all the entertaining and all the dining, no longer in the hall, but upstairs on the next floor in a room called the Great Chamber.
Well, this is fascinating. I know I am intrigued. And I love what we're learning here about the fork and the knife and the different rooms and how the differences between dining then and dining today occurred. Brigitte, what are some of your favorite resources, in addition to, please tell us more about your Tudor home and how we can engage with history there, but what are some of your books and resources you can recommend we use to learn more?
Right. There are actually a lot you could choose from. There are a few that entirely and only deal with cutlery, but there is at least one. But my favorite one, which I read fairly recently, is called A Day at Home in Early Modern England by Tara Hamling and Catherine Richardson. It's all about material culture and domestic life between 1500 and 1700. And that really is a fascinating read. Now, another one I've recently obtained is called Feast and Fast, The Art of Food in Europe between 1500 and 1800, edited by Victoria Avery and Melissa Calares-Su. Now, that book accompanied a special exhibition at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. Sadly, it had to close early because of the pandemic. Now, another book that's really good for people who would like to read more about it is called A Cultural History of Food in the Renaissance, and it's edited by Ken Albala. And the last one I can thoroughly recommend is Cutlery for the Table, A History of British Table and Pocket Cutlery by Simon Moore. However, that is very specific. It's a big book, and you need to be really what we in England call an anorak. You need to be really interested in specifically cutlery because it goes into a lot of detail.
If you're absolutely obsessed with pocket cutlery,
Yes.
that's the one to go for. Got it. Well, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
There are so many. What a difficult choice. But I think for me, right now, it would be an original copy of Thomas Tusser's 500 Points of Good Husbandry with a book of housewifery.
I'll have to go and look, but I think you picked that one last time as well.
Really, I think I might have picked John Gerard's Herbal. I don't know.
Oh, I see. You made sure that you weren't picking the same one from last time.
I as I said, there are so many, and it will be really a tough one.
Thank you so much for doing that. Yeah, well, I think this one is excellent as well. We'll link to Brigitte's book recommendations as well as her Deserted Island book that you can check out, all in the show notes for today. Now, Brigitte, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, as you know, we have moved to new premises here in Norfolk to make the Tudor and 17th century experience even more memorable for our guests.
It is so beautiful. There's pictures on their Facebook page. It's just gorgeous.
But it's also to fulfill a lifetime dream of living in a Tudor manor, I have to confess. And we were hoping to have been entertaining visitors by now, but the current global pandemic has pushed that a little bit further into the future, I'm afraid. So we are facilitating the extra time to get super ready, and we are looking into other ways how we can engage with our potential future guests at the moment. And another very exciting prospect is that we are thinking about hosting Tudor weddings in the future.
Wow, what a great idea.
Yes, because we have our very own chapel here.
Do you really? I'm making this very surprised, joyful face. That's fantastic.
Yeah. And maybe not so quite exciting is that I've started to write on my second Tudor cookery and recipe collection book. And this time I'm going to focus on vegetarian food by popular request.
Well, fantastic. Those are great. We look forward to keeping up with you and staying in touch and seeing all the great things that are coming from the Tudor and 17th century history experience. Thank you, Brigitte Webster, so much for being here and walking us through the history of cutlery in Shakespeare's lifetime.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thoroughly enjoyed being with you.
Brigitte has provided some historical sketches of the fork and the 16th century dining experience, which we have placed in the show notes for today's episode. Find those as well as links to the history resources you can use to explore the fork and culinary dining practices, as well as how you can visit Tudor and 17th century experience, which offers immersive history tours, including a dining experience. If you are a member of That Shakespeare Life and part of our Experience Shakespeare Digital History activity kits, you actually get an exclusive discount to this dining experience. So make sure you check out the resources tab in the members area to find out more about that. Be sure to subscribe to the blog and follow us on social media, as we'll be featuring these historical sketches, paintings, and more from the episode all throughout the week for you to see and enjoy. Learn more and follow along at CassidyCash.com/episode 112. That's CassidyCash.com/EP112. How would you like to see the video of this week's interview? You can watch this interview as well as other exclusive interviews not available anywhere else right inside That Shakespeare Life app. That's right. That Shakespeare Life is now streaming on our very own digital app. We are very excited to make this available. And not only can you stream podcast episodes anywhere you go, but the app contains exclusive content like activities, games, documentary shorts, expert interviews, and animated plays, all free from ads and available anywhere you might be. You can learn Shakespeare's history from the experts who know him best while you're in the carpool line, cooking dinner, or even while you're working out. Take Shakespeare history with you wherever you go, all without any commercials. Download the app now at CassidyCash.com/experience. That's CassidyCash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.